Chinese officials are being criticized in the international community for lying about the initial outbreak in their country. So what did China know and when?
Well, I think that in all likelihood, we don't know the actual number of cases.
This is Dean Cheng, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
What we do know is that the mayor of Wuhan back in January admitted that he had more information than he had been allowed to tell the public, and that 5 million people from Wuhan City, the epicenter of the virus, basically had left before lockdown. So what that suggests that if even 10% of those people had coronavirus, that's 500 million people who would have left the city. And something else to think about, if 10% of those people left the country, whether to go to work at different jobs, to be students, to visit relatives, that's 50,000 people who were potentially infected, who left, China.
We saw reports this week indicating that more than 400,000 people have traveled from China to the United States since this outbreak first began. When you talk about how this virus spreads, what role did the Trump administration play in making that decision to basically ban travel from the hotspots in China when this first started?
Well, I think that the administration, which of course took a lot of flack for doing so, probably cut the number of potential vectors and therefore the number of potential downstream infections significantly. It's probably worth noting here that WHO actually refused to issue a suggestion for travel bans for a very long time, said basically, well, we don't think it really would make that much of a difference. And that doesn't seem to have been consistent since every country that wound up with infections then wound up closing down travel, both within their borders and then across their borders.
Do you think because the Chinese have seen what happened with the early reporting and oftentimes lack of early reporting, as well as how large this outbreak has become, do you see the Chinese as changing their behavior when it comes to some of the wet markets that they have, and many of the reports indicating that this could have all started based off of a foodborne illness?
I think that wet markets are as much part of the culture as anything else, and culture is always one of the hardest things to change. I think that certainly there is a desire on the part of the Chinese government and economy to shift towards prepackaged foods in places sold like supermarkets, but it's very hard, again, to change the culture. And then when you wind up with folks, Western journalists in places like Bloomberg and the Washington Post saying, hey, wet markets are reopening in China and that's a good thing, you're going to wind up with very little pressure to close down wet markets, because they can point to Western journalists and say, see, they agree with us.
When it comes to the United States and China in terms of defense posturing during a pandemic, do you think the Chinese were better prepared or worse prepared than the United States? I know that you've studied the defense industrial complex of the Chinese pretty extensively.
So the Chinese are not a market economy. The Chinese economy has significant portions that are still state-run and state-directed. So when an order comes down to start building X or stop making Y, they can do that fairly quickly. On the other hand, that also is an obstacle to innovation because you've really centralized power at the top. So when you look at the range of companies that are now making ventilators and masks, everyone from MyPillow to GM, that is a flexibility that I'm not sure the Chinese system has. Right now, we and the Chinese are in a race to develop a vaccine, partly out of basic humanitarian and medical considerations, but there's also a political element here. China, if it develops the vaccine first, will be able to say, we have a global-level, first-class pharmaceutical industry, and we can clean up messes, wherever they come from. That's a huge political selling point and bragging point.
Do you think the Chinese will rush the vaccine process in a way the United States might not be able to because of regulations in America?
That's a great question. We don't have much insight, I suspect, into how the Chinese are going to go about human trials and testing. We have examples of, for example, the Chinese doctor who manipulated the human genome in a couple of girls, I think it was, babies, who were then brought to term. This is something nobody else has done anywhere else in the world. He got a lot of condemnation, but it's not clear that, he's been arrested and all that sort of thing, the way Dr. Lee was for revealing COVID-19. So I think we'll have to wait and see. But absolutely, I hope everyone keeps China under close scrutiny to see how they are willing to go about trying to develop a vaccine.
And when you talk about scrutiny and China, is there a mechanism in the international arena to hold the Chinese accountable for the lack of reporting early on in terms of cases and deaths and the likely push of misinformation that we've seen from Beijing?
Well, I think that one of the most important things is to not forget, which means knowing what it is that they did and confronting it. That requires things like a free press to do its job, which is to look with skepticism not just at the actions and words of an American administration, but those of a Chinese administration as well, and not necessarily accept Chinese comments at face value any more than they accept White House comments at face value. I think that we should keep this in mind when the Chinese push for whoever will be the next head of WHO. When the Chinese say that they want to be part of international consortiums of drug manufacturers and things like that, we need to remember how the Chinese behaved when the pandemic really hit the fan, and not treat them like, well, they're another great power and they will act the same way that France does, or the United States does, or Canada does.
Do you see China as using this pandemic as an opportunity to strengthen relationships with American allies in places like Europe?
Absolutely. I think that we are seeing the Chinese make a broad push, and not just in Europe, but around the world, of saying, look, we are sending aid to the Netherlands, to Turkey, to Italy, to Spain. Now, it seems like in a lot of cases, the personal protective equipment may not work. But again, that's a matter of whether anyone is paying attention and publicizing this. I personally also predict that the Chinese are going to tie 5G and Huawei sales to coronavirus, especially because, of course, we're seeing a global demand for bandwidth that's just unprecedented. And I fully expect the Chinese to say, hey, in preparation for the next time, you're going to want a lot more bandwidth, which means 5G, and Huawei can build that for you.
And finally, I'd like to ask you, because of your experience in defense and military knowledge, talking about biological weapons, what did this pandemic show the international community when it comes to their preparedness for the possibility of biological weapons being introduced more often in modern warfare?
I think that the rapidity of its spread, the fact that it has permeated pretty much everybody, is a real warning to nations that biological warfare is very difficult to control, if not impossible. The idea that you could let something like this loose but keep your own country safe is almost certainly a mirage. What it might tell, however, terrorist organizations, nihilists, Aum Shinrikyo types who want to bring about simply chaos, what's the line from the movie, to watch the world burn. I think that this may have incentivized them because of the exact same qualities. It can spread fairly quickly, it can get everywhere, and very, very few countries are really prepared for this. So to me, what this really says is that there needs to be more international cooperation to try and make sure that nothing like this ever gets loose into the hands of terrorist organizations.
Dean Cheng, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Cheng, thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.